To me, one of the challenges in making progress relative to animal welfare is bridging the gap from what we understand in terms of the science, what makes sense from a scientific perspective, to what the expectations of and understanding by the broader public, to what we can get done on the farm relative to both the infrastructure on the farm and the willingness of farmers to adopt some of these changes. Bridging that gap, or those two gaps or three gaps, is the crux of this episode. My name is Mike Von Massow, and this is the Food Focus Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Beth Ventura, who's a teaching professor specializing in animal welfare and behavior at the University of Manitoba. Have you ever started a conversation expecting it to go in a particular direction, and once you get into that conversation, it goes in a completely different direction? My original intent in talking to Beth was to talk to her about some recent work she did relative to public perceptions of particularly dairy producers, and the understanding that as people understood some practices on some farms better, they became less enthusiastic in their perceptions of the industry. While Beth and I do talk about that a little bit, we spent more time talking about some of the challenges of crossing the bridge from here's what we know is the right thing to do to how do we get different stakeholders, particularly producers, to adopt some of the changes that we understand to be best without sort of offending them, without pushing them beyond areas that are comfortable, understanding that they believe they are doing some really good things. So to me, this conversation epitomizes, frankly, one of the reasons I'm interested in the study of animal behavior, in animal welfare. I spend a lot of time thinking about public and consumers. Beth spends a lot of time thinking about the animals, particularly, and studying the animals. And really, one of the keys to making progress is understanding how producers make these decisions. You'll perhaps remember this as a theme from my conversation with Dr. Ellen Goddard, and I think that this is a natural next step in that discussion. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I expect you will too. Well, hello, Beth. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'd like to sort of start with what you do. We're going to talk about animal welfare and consumers' perceptions of animal welfare, but talk a little bit about what you do and where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I am currently an associate teaching professor of animal behavior and animal welfare at the University of Minnesota in the States. So, just a few hours south of you, many hours south of you, maybe. But anyway, yeah. So, my role is
Yeah.
mainly right now to develop and to teach undergraduate and sometimes graduate and veterinary student curriculum in the areas of animal behavior and animal welfare. And then, in addition to that, I do research mainly in the field of animal welfare science. And so I pull a little bit from more the applied ethology disciplines, but increasingly I'm also really borrowing from the social sciences to understand how we can work with humans a little bit more productively to achieve those science-based welfare improvements that we're all hoping to achieve.
So you talked about the importance of understanding what animals feel and what constitutes good welfare and bad welfare, but you've also added
Mm-hmm.
this social science element
Yes,
to understand
dimension
how
to it.
people
Yeah.
think about it. Why do you think that that's important?
I think that they're very complementary approaches, and I when I started out, I did not start out using social science methods. I wasn't even really that aware of them. Throughout my undergraduate and my master's work, I was focused more on applied animal work, and that work remains extremely important, and I remain fascinated by it. I still do it, but I also started to become interested in asking new questions like okay, once we maybe find a really good technique or a really good practice or a way to improve or mitigate, some animal welfare situation, what are we doing about it? Like, how can we get it implemented? How can we address the barriers maybe that may exist to implementation? And there's, barriers. There's tons of different types of barriers that we could go into categorizing, but most profound maybe in often situations economic barriers.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, I started realizing, like, okay, how do we actually like incorporate these changes into practice? And so often it's really impossible, and realistically I think also impractical, to expect that we should be able to do that without talking to the people on the ground and understanding what the barriers are for them, what their desired solutions are, how they interpret their work, how they navigate the challenges within. So I think at a very basic level, it's a pragmatic decision on my part, but it's also evolved into this. I'm really interested in the answers. I'm really interested what people think, and why they make the decisions that they do, and how we can maybe support them making decisions that we know from, maybe, or we're starting to get a sense from, the scientific applied sense is, okay, this could be a good thing, but how do we get it put into practice? The other dimension to it is, of course, like, something like animal welfare is an incredibly emotional topic. It's a complex one, and it's something that a lot of people care very strongly about, and that kind of situation sets you up for potential for a lot of conflict. And so part of why I'm also interested in using that kind of social science approaches to understanding where people are at with regards to some of these topics is so that it could hopefully help us navigate some of that complexity, so that different stakeholders can maybe work together more productively and deal with each other even across maybe vast differences.
So that's interesting, because I want to sort of get to that consumer side, the perceptions of welfare
Hmm.
and our understanding of welfare. But I hadn't
Yeah.
thought as much, although I should have, about some of those some of the hesitation we might have at the farm level. My One of my recent conversations for the podcast was with an ag economist, Dr. Ellen Goddard, and she talked about we have to understand farmers better in
Yeah,
order for us
100%.
to really understand how we can get policy implemented. And what you're saying, and it's a
Hmm.
perfect connection, is that's critical from a welfare perspective too. It's not just about knowing what's best for the animal. It's about finding ways to get animal care changes implemented.
100%. Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. And it's also important for farmer welfare. Like, so it's an animal welfare thing, but it's also a farmer welfare thing, because if we're ignoring these, like, this critical group, and we're not talking to them and we're not listening to them, I, I don't know what we're doing. Like, I think we can run into a lot of problems. And so, yeah, I would very much prefer to have that open line of communication and that path to engagement with this group, because ignoring this group is just gonna be a terrible idea. I would
Yeah.
say.
So in your experience, then, what are some of the concern? Is it people perceive us as mistreating animals, or people, what are some of the issues with producers? Because the truth is they care very strongly. They care a lot about
Hmm.
their animals, and so
Yeah.
some of these people pointing fingers makes them uncomfortable, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if I was a farmer, and I was seeing a lot of critique of different practices, I think that would be really hard for me to swallow as well. And that makes sense, of course, because and for a lot of folks, I can't speak for the farming community, because I'm not
Yeah,
technically a part of it.
yeah,
I'm adjacent to it, but a lot of for a lot of folks, like, farming is also identity. And so if you're critiquing a practice that is involved in someone's identity, of course someone's going to feel defensive and attacked. And over time, potentially that could create like a really unhealthy, situation for mental health. So I'm really sympathetic to that.
It is hard on mental health, and as you say,
Yeah.
farming is very much about identity, and if people are
Mhm.
questioning the way you're doing things, then it can be stressful. Do you see sometimes some resistance to change
Amongst
amongst the
farmers,
farm community? Yeah.
I think it very much it's hard for me to make generalizations because
Yeah,
just
I
because
apologize.
someone's no, that's okay because
Yeah.
I also do that in a lot, like a
Yeah.
lot of what I'm saying. I mean, I study, groups of the public, groups of farmers, groups of veterinarians, and of course, like, so I in shorthand will refer to them as like veterinarians, but it's, not all
Yeah.
veterinarians or whatever. But we've talked recently, to advisors, like farm advisors, for some other research that we've done recently, especially veterinarians, but also hoof trimmers. And what's really interesting when you listen to those folks who are advising farmers on a pretty near regular basis, one of their concerns often comes down to, I am concerned that the farmer is resistant to maybe some of my recommendations when it comes to animal care. And I don't know how to approach that with them. I don't know how to communicate well with them because I'm caught with this, I'm really sympathetic to what the farmer is going through and I have their back. But at the same time, how do I communicate, hey, maybe we should take another look at our lameness plan, without, like, so
Yeah.
struggling how to navigate that is, I think, a big struggle for at least veterinarians and hoof trimmers that we've interviewed lately. And so I hear from advisors that it can, amongst a certain portion of the farmers that they work with, it can be a challenge.
They understand how much of identity is tied up with that farmer, and it's important that they have an ongoing relationship.
Yeah.
Another of my recent conversations was with a dairy vet who talked about some of those conversations and some of those challenges, and I hadn't thought about how that can create stress as nobody likes to be criticized, and
No.
so if you're saying what might we do differently, sometimes that is perceived as you're doing something wrong. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's interesting to really think about, if our interest is in improving the welfare of animals, we not only have to understand what will improve the welfare of the animals, but we have to understand the decision making process at the farm and with those advisors so that we actually implement some of these changes.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a really complex web to navigate, right? So that's, I think, some of the other challenge that comes with this type of work is realizing that sometimes it's, and a lot of science wants to be like super generalizable so that like we can classify or put, a label on, okay, all farms or all farms in this region or all veterinarians over here. But the reality is that I think so much of this work is really contextualized. And so what may work for one farm doesn't work for the farm down the road. And even within a farm, what may work for one set of employees may not work as well for another. And I think that adds that extra layer of, okay, what do we do from here? But I do, the more I do this work, the more I really value the talking and the listening. Mostly the listening, letting the other folks talk so that we can understand where they are at.
That's so fascinating, and I hadn't really. It's bad because I'm a behavior guy, but I hadn't really thought about that sort of barrier to progress, and so that's really interesting. But you raised another interesting point, which is this sort of talking and listening, and a group we referred to earlier,
Hmm.
but haven't gotten into in a whole lot of detail, is the consumer, who is
Yeah.
increasingly playing a role in determining what best practice from a welfare perspective is.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that they're being led along to a degree because consumers don't have a really good understanding of welfare, or frankly a good understanding of how food is produced at all. And I'd be interested in your perspective on that. But
Mm-hmm.
but understanding and listening to where consumers are rather than trying to beat the science
Beat it
into
in.
them is also critical. Is also critically important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The so the public is a tricky thing, I think. And I think so. I don't do a lot of like consumer specific work. I do
Mm-hmm.
study the public, but I envision like, and I think of the public a little bit more broadly than their consumer role. Yes, 100%. The consumer role that they hold is incredibly important and very impactful. Like, and we can see how that is impactful, both because of what they are choosing to buy and what they are choosing to avoid buying, as well as how their beliefs and their desires are perceived by supermarket chains and food companies, because that will then maybe drive some of the decision making higher up in the supply chain. But separately from that, we're also aware of how important the public is in this conversation, even if they don't consume these animal products. Because even if they don't consume animal products, they still have a voice, because they, especially so down in the States, every year that we're voting, there's usually a handful of states that have some ballot, and some proposition on the some proposition on the ballot to say something about, tail docking of dairy cattle, or traditional cages for laying hens, or gestation stalls for sows, or so on and so forth. A lot of it's focused on like housing issues,
Yeah.
but so like folks still have a voice in the public, and can very powerfully influence what farming may look like. So that, I like to think of the public as kind of as citizen and as consumer. It also, I think,
Yeah.
helps remind us that all of us are also the public, and most of us are also consumer, if not, and of course all of us are citizens. So when it comes to how we approach this gulf that we have, and that we see, I think first I agree with you, like it's absolutely important to wrap our minds around like just how we're often occupying like a completely different world than they are, if they are not engaged in agriculture. If they're not engaged in agriculture, there is a decent likelihood that they may not know a whole lot of what we're doing on a daily basis. Increasingly though, I think folks are starting to glean a little bit about maybe common or typical practice on farms, although
Yeah.
we don't have as much research on this as I would like. And so I am interested in more people doing this kind of work so that we can start to kind of more clearly map out what people know and what they don't, what they have misconceptions about, and like absolute, like this is way out of left field, like under no circumstances would that happen, or it
Yeah.
doesn't happen. But then at the same time, there's we're also maybe confronting a deal of ignorance, or like a type of ignorance where it may benefit the industries that the public maybe doesn't know about certain things. And that's where I think it gets tricky, because sometimes ignorance can be really problematic for the industries, but other times it's maybe beneficial. And I hear these, it's not just my opinion saying that, like I'm analyzing really old focus groups, but I have to like
Yeah.
kick my butt in gear and actually write this paper up. But I'm analyzing some focus groups right now, speaking to primarily veterinarians that are in the livestock industry, that work in the livestock industries, and ask them these questions like, what do you think about the public, and what do you think their role is? What do you think they know? What do you think they don't know? And a lot of what they're bringing out is like, look, yeah, they've got a lot of like misconceptions, and this is really frustrating for us. But they're also like, in some respects, not aware of a lot of the things that I think if they were aware, we'd have even more problems. Like, oh, the fact that we're, at a lameness summit right now. Most folks probably
Yeah.
don't know that, lameness on a dairy farm is a challenge for a lot of dairy farms. Cow calf separation, like that's a
Yeah.
very uncomfortable topic for people to want to talk about. And putting aside like the complexity with the science, depending on what you measure, like I would guess that like the next ad that the California milk or Wisconsin milk puts out is not, hey guys, guess what? We like pull the calf from the
Yeah.
cow, and that's the way that we do it. And there are good reasons for why we do it. But yeah, that's not going to be the heading of the new advertisement campaign. So I think that's
No,
also something for
but
us to have to navigate as
no,
well.
go ahead. Yeah,
No, you're
I think
good.
you're exactly right. And there is this sort of cognitive dissonance with consumers,
Hmm.
with livestock products. They understand that there might be something that they're not comfortable with, uh, but they there's some willful ignorance on some elements of this, right? Nobody wants to sort of
Yeah,
think about the
a
slaughterhouse
hundred percent.
as an example. and
Yep.
and but
Yeah.
but by the same token, and I hear this all the time from agricultural groups, to say, well, if
Hmm.
only we could get them to understand, we have to build trust. uh,
Yeah.
and we walk this delicate balance. Maybe there's some stuff that they don't want to know about, and if they find out about it, they won't be as
Yeah.
happy. But the truth is, those conversations are
Hmm.
going to be happening anyway. There are people who are going to raise,
Yes.
agriculture didn't raise gestation crates, and agriculture didn't raise battery cages. Someone else did. And then the public, and I like that distinction you made, sort of said, wait a minute, you're doing that,
Hmm.
we thought, you
Yeah.
know we didn't know. And so we have to sort of strike that balance. And I think it gets back to the point you made about listening as much as talking, because at some points
Hmm.
we may do things that even the science says is okay or is positive from a welfare
Hmm.
perspective. But if the
Hmm.
public's not happy with it, then that consumer
Hmm.
element comes in.
Hmm. And I think also there's the, I mean, in some situations it puts us in a really uncomfortable tension, but I think there are also, by the same token, a lot of situations where it can be win-win-win. So, like for example, one practice in the dairy industries often will disbud, the young calf or the young dairy goat. And the procedure itself, we know we have a ton of science to suggest that the procedure is painful to the calf or the goat or whatever it is. Um,
Mhm.
and we also know that and we also know that if you don't disbud, you may be facing more severe situations from a welfare standpoint later on. If the horns are intact and the cattle are in, a free stall environment, maybe there's concerns of, risks to cattle safety or risks to human and handler safety. So you're in this maybe position of trading, a short-term welfare cost for a hoped for longer-term welfare win. And now you're like, oh my God, how do I reconcile this with the fact that the public doesn't like disbudding? So we don't have tons of
Yep.
research on this particular topic, but we have a little. And what we do know is there are ways to refine the procedure. So, for example, comprehensive pain relief and mitigation
Yep.
for this procedure. And we know that this is a compromise until we figure out fully how to introduce polled genetics into dairy herds. Um, Maybe in the meantime, one thing we can do that kind of is a win for cows is comprehensive pain relief. We need to maybe better figure out how to support farmers and veterinarians in delivering this and addressing whatever barriers they're facing. But then this is also a win for the public. The public supports, okay, if you are going to do it, you need to be using pain relief. So hopefully there are examples of win-win-win. And some of it is low-hanging fruit. Others are going to be a whole hot mess to address, maybe. But I kind of
Well,
sometimes,
and
maybe it's just because I'm lazy, I like to focus on the stuff we can win first.
yeah, and I think there's some value in getting at that low hanging fruit as well, because
Yeah,
it shows that you can have a conversation and make progress, and that
exactly.
can build confidence in the
Yeah,
process.
I
But
agree 100%.
I do think there remain some issues, some practices
Hmm.
that that consumers might, with all of the efforts we make to quote unquote build trust, consumers might look at
Hmm.
us and say, no, we're just not comfortable with that. And at that stage,
Hmm.
we have to decide what we're willing to, how, whether we're going to lose them as a consumer or
Hmm.
lose some license to do it if it's the broader public. I mean, clearly there is an element of the
Yeah,
public who doesn't think we should have animal agriculture at all. And what we're
yeah,
doing is sort of managing how big a group that is. But if
yeah.
that group got bigger because people weren't uncomfortable, there are going to be some challenging conversations coming.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those conversations are happening, and they have been happening from like an incredibly pragmatic state. Like I am interested in understanding like what people's objections are. Um,
Yeah.
I am also interested in understanding. Okay, I, I'm not going to sit here and be like, hey, we don't need to change anything about food production. Like, there are a lot of things that we need to change about food production. And I think it's disingenuous if folks get so defensive that they can't be like, yeah, okay, we do. Like, it doesn't mean we're not trying and working and doing an amazing job right now. But when it comes to something like this that has so many impacts and is so like knitted into like the course of how human society runs and exists, I think it is hard to do so, but it's also really important if everyone who is involved in this process can be like, what can we do better? Um,
Yeah.
and whether that is a conversation that is or is not motivated by what the public is asking, I guess I'm less concerned about that. I wish that we can just have these conversations anyway, and say, okay, like where can we actually identify where we can improve, and what's possible to do now, what's possible to do in 5 years from now, and 10 years from now, etc. And supporting people to make those changes. And I guess I'm interested ultimately in the public, both because I think it's just like interesting. Like I'm
Yeah.
nosy, and I
Yeah.
guess it's just really interesting to find out what people think. Um, but it's also, I guess I got involved in this question initially, like social science initially, because I came into my PhD and I was like, man, how do we like create change, like by empowering consumers to you know support like really welfare friendly practices, and like farmers who are really pushing this and like make sure that like those guys have markets and da 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 da. Like how do we tell people like how to believe like I do, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then when I started getting into that, I was like, whoa, I can't do that. It's not going to work. Like as soon I started reading, I started like doing the research, and I was like, it's not going to work. It's not going to work for me to like change someone's mind about farming or animal welfare or anything by me going in and telling them, look, here's what is going on. Here's why I think it's cool and important, and here's all the evidence to back up my position. Now you need to change your mind. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that.
Yeah. No, it's entirely true. So we need to understand, uh, and get a sense of, and eventually there's going to be compromise on both sides. There'll be some things that we
Exactly.
agree to disagree on. There'll be some
Hmm.
people who produce for some markets, and some people who do a better job and have a different market and maybe get a premium in that
Hmm.
market.
Hmm.
And there'll be some people who choose to say, well, no, I'm not comfortable with that process. I'm just not going to consume it all anymore.
Yep.
All of those
Yep.
things are potential eventualities, but I, I, I think, to me, the critical thing is to be having that conversation. And a student once
100%.
told me, and I don't know, I honestly don't know if she ripped this quote off from someone or if she came up with it herself, but she said, a conversation can't be two monologues. And that's
Yeah.
very much what we have right now. Is we're trying to talk people into what we're
Hmm.
doing is fine. People are saying back, no, I'm not comfortable with that. And some of those things that they're not comfortable with may have nothing to do with science, right? Is and so we have to have those conversations, and there's going to be give and take on both sides. But to me, it's really heartening to hear people like you who are doing the welfare science also thinking about farmers and veterinarians and the broader public, to say, if we want to really make change relative to welfare, we have to think about all of that.
Hmm. Yeah, you said you made 100 very nice points there. First and most recently, it's definitely not people just like me. Like there are tons of people that are doing this type of work. So I encourage you to like really get in there if you want, because there's a lot of
Yeah.
people. You highlighted something I think that's not just critical to capturing this conversation about welfare and farming, but realistically, like so much of what's going on that we're seeing in society right now, especially, I mean, realistically, globally, but we're seeing it especially in Canada, and we're seeing it especially in the US. The US. Conversations about what side of the political spectrum are you on, or how are you navigating COVID? Like
Yeah.
it's a lot of people feel very strongly about what side they are on with regards to that. I'll stick with the science communication for a minute, because like if you're tasked, with like, okay, we got this good science about climate
Yeah.
change, or vaccines, or whatever it is, and we know that this stuff's going to happen, and you need to come and drink from this cup of knowledge that we have, right? Please drink from this cup of knowledge. Please God, drink. And then a certain portion of people don't want to drink, and they say, no thank you, that cup is poisonous. um, Continue. That's a real challenge, and I think there the scope of experts and expertise in the science communication field, which is adjacent to like the scientists themselves. Sometimes the scientists themselves are also really excellent science communicators, but it's not always the case necessarily, and
No.
it's not a knock or a disparagement against them. It's just I wasn't necessarily trained in any of that throughout the course of my graduate work, and because it's a specialized thing, and it's a specialized set of expertise. And I would love to have more synergy between the scientists like that are doing the thing, and the folks who understand, okay, how do we broach that communication gap? How do we do it effectively? Because so often, for something like welfare, we'll come back to welfare now, and farm animal
Yeah.
welfare. Welfare is a hard thing to broach the gap on, in part because, yes, people's opinions and concerns about welfare come down in part to what they know about it and what they don't know about it. And that knowledge will absolutely influence where they believe and what they believe. But it's not the only thing that
Mhm.
influences that. We have to account
No.
for values and what people actually weigh as important in a given set of knowledge. And at the end of the day, people do not necessarily weigh these things the same. And this is, I think, where we get so much of the conflict and argument of what is humane or not on a farm, for example, because we do know from some of the past literature of different scientists all over the world who've talked to farmers, who've talked to veterinarians. Historically, a lot of the emphasis on welfare has been to focus on, okay, well, how is the animal's body doing? Is the animal
Yeah.
physically healthy? Are we doing a good job with nutrition? Are we doing a good job with biosecurity, and shelter, and making sure that the animals are fed and watered well, and are free from disease and free from injury. And that is, of course, a hugely important component of welfare. I'm not going to, of course it is. And folks who focus on that are absolutely right to focus on those things. But it's not the only thing that makes up welfare, and it influences welfare. Oftentimes, someone who is maybe concerned about animal agriculture, maybe a lot of their concerns on the welfare side have to do with how natural it is or is perceived to not be. So if the animals aren't having outdoor access, if the animals aren't necessarily in a social structure that they would have evolved to be in, or they're not weaned on a natural kind of schedule or whatever it may be, those concerns, those aren't wrong concerns. Those do also have an influence on welfare. But if you've got someone that's focused on the natural stuff, and you've got someone who's primarily focused on the health stuff, and then they're just talking about how important each of these are, they're probably not on the same wavelength. And it's not that
Yeah.
one is right
And
and
that
one
can
is
even happen
wrong.
within the science community.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
And if we
So
can't always agree in the science community, then it's no surprise that there'll be differences of values and differences in expectations, compounded by differences of understanding or knowledge
exactly.
in
Yeah.
those conversations,
It,
and we have to
exactly.
understand that they're not going to be easy.
No, exactly, and that's for that difference in knowledge is compounded by experience and expertises, but those in turn, I haven't confirmed this empirically, but those also are bound up in things like how you were brought up and where you were brought up, and were you brought up in a rural environment or an urban environment, and what was the
Yeah.
religion of your family, and what was what was your community like, what kind of classes did you take in undergraduate if you happen to go to do your bachelor's, like
Yeah.
what were the values of your professors that were subtly communicated to you throughout the course of your education. um, all of that binds together to make people's assessments of these things extremely diverse.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I know you're not the only one, and I'm not the only one asking these questions. But I think I'm optimistic that doing this interdisciplinary stuff, where we think not
Mm-hmm.
only about the science of welfare, but the role that different stakeholders have to play,
Mm-hmm.
will continue to get to make progress. I'm optimistic about the process. Are you?
Yeah, yeah, I am too, and I think that part of this is being engaged in this type of work. It's also given, like, the more I learn about where others are at, like the more empathy that like it's has been instilled in me, honestly. Like, I'm a lot more empathetic to a much wider range of folks, I think, than I was when I started off doing this type of work, because I was, young and naive and stubborn in my, I'm still not necessarily young, but I'm still a little bit naive and stubborn, I would say. But this type of work allowed me to yeah, get a little bit more empathy for a lot of folks and what they're dealing with, what they're living through, which I think is good. So I encourage. I sent you that chapter that we recently
Yeah.
published, and I really encourage all of us who are in this type of work to dig into some of that, like, literature on like values and attitudes of different folks, because it really, I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, whether it's farm animal welfare or any of a number of issues that you highlighted that are going on in the
Yeah,
world today, a little bit of empathy can go a long way, I think, in making everything
yeah.
better.
Bringing it back to what I do now, I do a lot of, I'm working with a lot of students in the classroom, and when I started this, I started figuring out how to, like, build in lessons plans for my students to not only learn the science of welfare, the science of behavior, but also that kind of, okay, and how do we work with people with these issues? And I find it I'm very heartened by students coming out now, and if I think the future is bright, especially working with a lot of these types of students. They're really open to learning these types of skills.
That's great. I think that's an excellent place to end.
Yeah.
And so thank you for taking the time, Beth. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I expect I'm going to be hitting you up for another one because I think you and I could chat for hours.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. This was great. Thank you so much. You are super fun to chat to and a wonderful podcast host.
That wraps up another episode of the Food Focus podcast. We very much appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you just discovered Food Focus, you can subscribe anywhere you get podcasts. If you enjoy the podcast, please give us a review. It helps others find us. Before we go, I want to thank my producer, Zach, for his hard work in making each episode sound good and for his original music that helps us transition. He does the hard work, and we get to have all of the fun. Thanks. Have a great day.